Sponsored by Bangtak, Sustainable Business Development in Harmony with the Environment and Society.
In ASEAN, women and children represent over 50% of the region's 600 million people. However, a large number of women are being treated unequally. Their rights are abused, and ASEAN has recently held the first ministerial meeting on women in Vientiane, Laos. Wide ranges of issues on women are being discussed on the table to improve the living conditions of women in ASEAN and to empower them. Towards 2015 Today has a chance to sit down and talk with Mr. John Hendra, Assistant Secretary General, Deputy Executive Director for Policy and Program of UN Women, about the agenda and the outcomes of the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Women and Women Issues in Vietnam and Myanmar.
We have recently heard about your trip to Laos to participate in the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Women. Could you please share with us your the topics, the agendas that were being discussed on in the meeting, as well as the outcomes of the meeting?
Certainly. I think the first point I'd like to say is that it was very important that ASEAN is having the first Women's Ministerial Meeting. It's very important to put priority on women and on issues of gender equality, but how to advance women's rights and empowerment of women. Secondly, the theme of the meeting was on gender equality and environmental sustainability. So a lot of discussion in terms of how important it is to look at gender concerns, and particularly how environmental sustainability affects women and girls, who are often some of the most vulnerable, or the most vulnerable, particularly in terms of the negative impacts often of climate change. Thirdly, as UN Women, I had a chance to meet with the ASEAN ministers myself to discuss three issues. One issue was on the post-2015 agenda. You were very much focused on the achievement of the MDGs, where Thailand has done very well. But there's a big global discussion now, what happens after post-2015. So I had a chance to talk to all the ASEAN women ministers about that. And then secondly, about the Commission for the Status of Women, which is held once a year in New York. And the upcoming theme for the next one in February, March will be ending violence against women and girls in all its forms. So it was really important to talk with the women ministers about how to make sure we have the most successful outcome we can, but how to make sure we really make progress in terms of addressing violence against women and girls. And finally, I had a chance to speak to them about UN Women. You know, we're quite a new agency. January 2013, we'll have our second birthday. And so it was a chance to talk to them about how we are organized in this region, but also to ask them, frankly, how they thought we were doing and how we can improve our support to them.
What was the response from the ministers from ASEAN?
Well, I think very, very strong and open response. I think we also discussed how to deepen the collaboration between ASEAN and UN Women. We have a number of joint initiatives in terms of gender equality, in terms of migration. So there was the discussion about how to deepen those, but also discussion particularly about the next development agenda, post-2015, and how I think we feel it needs to be from a rights-based approach, so it needs to look at issues of inequality and non-discrimination and participation and inclusion. And then we particularly talked about the need to put women at the center of the next agenda, to make sure the next set of goals really has a very strong goal on addressing gender inequality, the challenges for women and women's rights, but also that all the other goals have an appropriate treatment or are robust in terms of how they address women. And then finally on CSW, we just talked about the challenges of violence, the culture of violence against women, and how we really need to work much more closely together. Governments, as an ASEAN member states and women ministers, but governments as a whole, parliaments, civil society, all parts of society, and UN and the broader international community. So it was a short, I mean, this was about 50 minutes, but it was very focused in terms of those three agendas.
So we can expect more cooperation between UN Women and ASEAN in the near future?
Certainly.
Mr. Hendra served as UN Resident Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative in Vientiane from 2006 to 2011. He shared with us his experience during his term in Vietnam, as well as challenges Vietnamese women are facing.
Could you please share with us your experience there in Vietnam?
Sure, I was UN Resident Coordinator and the Resident Representative of UNDP, but UN Resident Coordinator in Vietnam for 5 years, from 2006 to May of 2011. and then I joined UN Women as Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director. My experience was very intense, but very positive. In Vietnam, we were doing a pilot called Delivering as One. There were 8 pilot countries around the world trying to make the UN more effective and have greater impact. It was all about how the UN can work much more together. And in the end, we really succeeded. I think we tried to shift our work from sometimes too many projects, but shift what is upstream to focus more on the policies that are most important to Vietnam, on climate change, on social protection, on gender equality. We also try to do much more public advocacy. And so we tried to advocate much more strongly on issues of ethnic minority, women in poverty, or macroeconomic reform. We were very concerned 2 or 3 years ago about increasing inflation, because inflation really hurts the poor, and there's a need to address these issues across the government. So it was a very positive experience. I think we had a much bigger impact than when we started. And on a personal level, it was a challenging time for Vietnam, but I very much appreciate in Vietnam that the Vietnamese government and the Vietnamese people hold the UN in high regard. So it was our responsibility to reform ourselves, to give the best assistance. But also, people in Vietnam listened to what the UN had to say. So it was important that the UN said the best that we could. So that was our challenge, was how to get the UN working much more better together, but to give the Vietnamese government sort of the good policy advice, sometimes policy choices, but also talk about those issues that we feel Vietnam needed to address. Because I was there at a very dynamic period when they were moving from a less developed country to a middle-income country. And as you know, in Thailand, once you become a middle-income country, there's a whole new set of challenges. So it was very stimulating time to be there. And myself and my family really enjoyed living there as well.
Okay, talking about the gender equality in Vietnam in particular, what are the problems that Vietnamese women are facing right now that need to be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is based more on when I left, which was a year and a half ago. But I would say 2 or 3 things. I think a couple of very important positive elements. One is Vietnam has the highest level of, either the highest or close to the highest, it's between Vietnam and Laos, the highest level of women in leadership positions. So the National Assembly and in the cabinet. So that's very important. And then secondly, they have a very good policy framework. They have a law on gender equality, and they have a law against domestic violence. Not as comprehensive as Thailand's policy framework, but that was important. But I would say there are many challenges. I would list maybe 4. The first challenge was really like in Thailand, like in every country in the world, is violence against women. We did a survey of as the UN overall, WHO and UNFPA and UN Women's predecessor, UNIFEM, and other parts of the UN. We did a survey together on domestic violence. And it came with very high figures. I think 45% of women have faced violence. And this was a surprise to people. People did not know that violence was so high. So that's a challenge that Vietnam has. It's important it has a law, but most importantly, it implements the law and has capacity for the law. I think a second challenge was really being able to really understand what's happening to women. Vietnam has done very well on the MDGs in the aggregate, sort of the national average. But when you disaggregate by region, you see that there's certain parts of Vietnam where they're still quite a ways behind, particularly areas where there's ethnic minorities. And we found that particularly ethnic minority women are particularly vulnerable. In some cases, the rate of maternal mortality, which is the most difficult MDG to achieve in Vietnam and globally, but in some areas of ethnic minorities, it was 5 or 6 or 7 times more, so a huge difference. So there's a real need for the Vietnamese government to recognize to kind of unbundle the poverty situation and look specifically at areas of ethnic minority and make sure that the ethnic minorities are more involved in developing the policies themselves. Because experience shows for development to be effective, people need to own it and be a part of its design. I think a third challenge is really in terms of economic empowerment. About 600 million women around the world are in vulnerable employment. So employment in terms of low wage, often no social protection, so very vulnerable, and that's the case in Vietnam. I mean, in terms of producing shoes and shirts and very much sort of the low wage and textile. So it was really important to look at their rights, women's rights, how to advance their rights, how to advance the situation for more decent work, but also how to look at social protection. And social protection, particularly in terms of access to health insurance, and also to look at how to improve their situation and make the work that the working conditions better, but also the kind of environment they're in much more protected. Maybe a fourth challenge, I think, would be for migrant workers in particular. Migration is a dynamic in this region and sub-region, and it was the same in Vietnam. But many migrant workers and women migrant workers are particularly vulnerable to trafficking, but also vulnerable in terms of not having social services. Mm-hmm. So social services is still based on registration. So when you migrate and move, you're not able to access, what was really fundamental health insurance and social security. So I think that's another challenge. Mm-hmm. And then I think, finally there's a challenge, I think, in terms of how to really empower women in Vietnam, like any country, empower them economically, empower them politically, and really being able to maximize everything that women can contribute to society. At the same time, minimizing the negative impact on them, and particularly the impact of very high inflation, as was the case in Vietnam, or climate change, where there was particularly serious negative impact. So I think those are two or three things that they've done well, but I think 4 or 5 mm-hmm. things they need to continue to focus on. So
how did UN Women cope with those challenges of Vietnam?
I think very much as with the rest of the UN team, we very much worked as one. Mm-hmm. As one UN is really helping the government when it developed its policies and its laws to make sure it was looking at other examples and to get the most effective law. We help them by building their capacity to implement the law. Many countries in the world have good laws, but then if they're not implemented, so what? Mm-hmm. So we helped a lot in terms of building national capacity, in terms of being able to properly implement the law. We also helped a lot in terms of advocacy, in terms of being able to talk more publicly about violence, about some of these issues that ethnic minority poverty, some of these, how to improve working conditions, how to make employment less vulnerable. So we did that through policy advice, through focusing on capacity building, through advocacy, and trying to stimulate more of a public policy dialogue on them. Mm-hmm.